wants a tasty morsel of treachery and treason. The truth. I can give that to you. We're up to number 9. 1986. The Hawke government unlawfully passes the Australia Act 1986, which is the final action required to completely remove Australia from the British Commonwealth. The Australia Act 1986 and the following reprints, Act 1992 Queensland, allows government to make laws without the consent of the people. The only true constitution is the original Constitution of Australia 1901, which in its opening statement states, the people have agreed to unite in one indissoluble federal commonwealth under the Constitution, hereby established. Therefore, it created the Commonwealth of Australia in its opening statement. This definition states that the people under this Constitution are the Commonwealth of Australia. And this is why there can be no change to the Constitution or the constitutional arrangements without the consent of the people, men and women. A list of referendums in Australia since the original Constitution of 1901 is as follows. Thank you.
You. He's a good one.
That is why anyone promoting a hidden agenda that is alien to that of the Constitution must find alternative means of achieving that agenda to bypass an impenetrable safeguard of the people's rights. Impenetrable because it is of the people. This is also why Bob Hawke brought in the Australia Act to veil the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia, which would cover up Whitlam's crime of using the Statute Law Revision Act 1973 to remove the words the Commonwealth of and of the Commonwealth from all federal legislation to create an independent pseudo-nation called Australia.
Pseudo-nation? Who wants a pseudo-nation? Not me.
This created Australia, a simulated fake nation with no people. How could there be any people when they are all in the Commonwealth of Australia? In addition, no assets because these all belong to the people, the Commonwealth of Australia. But that didn't matter because the name Australia has been in common use forever, which was an excellent decoy to the Commonwealth of Australia. It was the alternative means that Bob Hawke was looking for. Therefore, we must ask the question, is it valid? Firstly, to ascertain this, let's apply the rule of law. In the first instance, this suggests an offence, treachery against the Commonwealth. The Crimes Act 1914, Section 24AA, treachery states, a person shall not do any act or thing with intent, 1, to overthrow the Constitution of the Commonwealth. This is covered in today's Criminal Code Act 1995, Section 80, 1AC, which states a person commits an offence if C, the person engages in the conduct with the intention of overthrowing the Constitution, the penalty in 1914, and still now for the offence of treachery is imprisonment for life. Secondly, no valid change can be made to the Constitution without the consent of the people. To get this act into effect, all of the state parliaments had to enact the Australia Acts Request Act. Yet there was no referendum held in any state. Nevertheless, each state passed an Australia's Act Request Act in 1985. The Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, and the premiers of each state conspired against the Commonwealth, the people. Thirdly, former Justice of the High Court, Michael Kirby, AC, CMG, has argued that the Australia Act 1986 is invalid. Former Justice Kirby stated that because the Australia Act contained amendments to the state constitutions of Queensland and Western Australia, it is inconsistent with Section 106 of the Constitution and is not a valid exercise of Commonwealth legislative power. Finally, the states could not validly enact the Australia Act Request Act 1985 because A, no referendum was held in any state, and B, each Australia Act Request Act invalidated itself at its first schedule, Section 5B, and could not be lawfully used to support the enactment of the Australia Act. Section 5 limits the legislative powers of the Parliament of States granted in Section 2 and clearly states that these powers do not operate so as to give any force or effect to a provision of an act that is repugnant to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. However, the aim of each Australia Acts Request Act is deleterious to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. This makes the Australia Acts Request Acts repugnant to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. Then, by the provision of Section 5 of their own first schedule, the Australian Acts Request Acts are invalid. Reference to the lack of a referendum in respect of the Australia's Act Request Act means that protocol was not followed. In the Australia Act at Section 6, it states, a law made by the Parliament of the state shall be of no force or effect unless it is made in such a manner and form as may from time to time be required by a law made by that Parliament, whether made before or after the commencement of this Act. In other words, such a law is invalid if it is not made in the manner and form required by a law made by that Parliament. Sorry to bore you guys. Did you leave? Oh, they've left. This was entrenched in the Constitution of Queensland by Section 53 and others before and after the enactment of the Australia Acts Request Act 1985. In respect to Queensland, its legislation clearly set out such manner and form, including the need for a referendum. Sir Joe Bajolki-Peterson said in a speech recorded in Hansard, Queensland, on 7th of the 12th, 77, Only if the people of Queensland vote for a change will it be possible for Australia as a whole to become a republic, because you cannot change the monarchy in one part of Australia unless you change it in the whole. To entrench the present system, the bill provides that none of its clauses can be altered by Parliament unless the bill is first presented to the people by way of referendum, as prescribed in this bill. The requirement of entrenchment, section 53, is also itself entrenched, so that the guarantee cannot be undone, such as has been done in other parts of the Commonwealth nations where a republican form of government has been brought about contrary to the Constitution. It is obvious then that the failure by Queensland Parliament to uphold correct manner and form in respect to the enactment of the Australia's Act Request Act 1985 invalidates that Act. To further show this Act is invalid, we must look into the actions of Peter Beattie when he then replaced the Queensland Constitution 1867 with the new Queensland Constitution 2001. Peter Beattie justified this to Parliament by telling them that it was to consolidate and modernise the Queensland Constitution to bring it into the modern era. No one in the House questioned him, and nobody told the people. Here is how he did it. He designed the new Constitution to be unnoticeable, especially in fundamental legislation. This included not having anything in it that would be seen as confrontational, so notations were used. For example, removing the right of referendum would be the very first confrontational, wouldn't it? So the first thing that was done was removal of the first page of the following. The requirements of referendum established under the Constitution Act 1867, Constitution Act Amendment Act 1890, and Constitution Act Amendment Act 1934. If we now look at Section 3 of the Queensland Constitution 2001, we see that the purpose of this Act is, this Act declares, consolidates and modernises the Constitution of Queensland. Then this is followed by a note that states, however, this Act does not consolidate the following constitutional provisions because of the special additional procedures, including approval by the majority of electors at a referendum that may be required. Constitution Act 1867, Sections 1, 2, 2A, 11A, 11B, and 53. Constitution Act Amendment Act 1890, Section 2, and Constitution Act Amendment Act 1934, Sections 3 and 4. Further, this Act does not consolidate the Constitution Act 1867, Sections 30 and 40. However, you may well say that this is only a note until you refer to Section 5. Note in text is part of this Act, which states, a note in the text of this Act is part of this Act, which clearly is here to give full effect to Section 3, which was just referred to. This leads us to realise that the purpose of this Act has been misstated. It should refer to the removal of constitutional provisions that include approval by the majority of electors at a referendum, as granted to the people of Queensland by the valid Constitution of Queensland 1867. Saying this then, how do the words declare, consolidate and modernise the Constitution of Queensland apply? Instead, you could use the following words: stealth, deceit, treachery against the people of Queensland in their place that would be more appropriate in this case. For instance, refer to section 95 of this 2001 Queensland Constitution that lists the legislation repeals by this Constitution at Schedule 3. And looking down the list of repealed legislation, we find the Australia Acts Request Act 1985, number 69. This legislation did its job in 1986 when the Australia Act 1986 was enacted. So why repeal it? And why create reprints under the Reprints Act 1992? An act that was created to change legislation at will of the Australian Act Request Act 1985 on 19th of the 7th, 94 and the 6th of the 6th, 2002. Then repeal it on the 6th of the 6th, 2002. It seems pointless rewriting a law and effecting change to it when it has no further effect. Why repeal it unless there was something to hide? So what was done to it before it was repealed? We have already seen that this Act invalidated itself at Section 5 in Schedule 1, but there was no change to Section 5. The most important change was in the preamble, which was entirely removed, which makes a nonsense of this Act. In the original wording of the Australia's Act Request Act 1985, it contains a preamble of 5 paragraphs, where each of the 2nd, 3rd and 4th paragraphs are reiterated in kind at sections 2, 3 and 4 of the Act. At first glance, the omission of the first 4 paragraphs may suggest that the Act has merely undergone a tidying up. The definition above the preamble is similar to the first paragraph, except it names those responsible for initiating the need for this Act. So why would you bother when the Act had done its job and cannot be used again, unless it's necessary to remove something that may be incriminating, such as the 5th paragraph. The 5th paragraph states, "Be it enacted by the Queen's most excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Queensland in Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows." What we have here in the 5th paragraph is A, this is the clause that enacts this legislative bill. B, it tells us who enacted the bill. And C, under whose authority it was enacted. Paragraph 5 creates the Act, which is presented for assent. So without paragraph 5, the bill remains a bill and is not a valid act of legislation. By removing this enactment clause from the Australia's Act Request Act 1985, it becomes invalid. It is not enacted and it is not authorised, which then invalidates the Australia Act 1986. Then, because the Australia's Act Request Act is invalid, the federal government under Bob Hawke had no right to invoke Section 51 of the Commonwealth Constitution, as not all of the states had made a valid request for a change in legislation. The result is there were no valid grounds for the Australia Act to be enacted. consent of the people must be sought through a referendum. Therefore, John Howard held a referendum to ask the public if they wanted to be a republic on the 6th of the 11th, 1999. But it was defeated. The Australian people did not consent. Therefore, it was never the wish of the Australian people to go down the path that Whitlam, Fraser, Hawke and Keating had pushed onto the public. Fact, we did not consent. Our Australia and we the people of Australia are now completely centralised and corporised by the Australian Government Corporation, and there was no referendum to request the consent of the people for these changes.